Hi, I'm Lori Roberts. I'm your host for Historically Speaking, and today we are going to be talking about deadly disasters of the decade. And with me today is my co-host, Lucas Calhoun, who is our historian on stage today. He's going to help me. And the two disasters that we're going to be talking about are the Titanic and the Lusitania. So we're going to jump right in here and get started so that we can get everything we've amassed. Yes. We have quite the stack of stuff. And I already told Maria I was going to sound like a squirrel over here because I'm going to be digging and rooting, get all kinds of good stuff. So the first thing I want to show is the picture of the Titanic. If you have watched the movie Titanic with James Cameron, you probably have seen lots of what we're going to show you in snippets. But this is the picture of the Titanic as it is sailing from, I think this is Ireland.
At the beginning, this is one of the last pictures, probably.
Yeah, this is Belfast. And the reason why we're using these two ship disasters from the decade of the 1910s is because there are Indiana connections.
Yes.
And so Lucas and I are going to try to bring in some of those connections, but also give you some history about the two ships because, you know, maybe all you know is the movie version. So I'm going to turn over to Lucas. I'm going to let you get started and maybe give us some information about the ship.
Well, we have so many great resources. This might be our most, our highest pile of resources that we've ever brought. This truly was a modern marvel. You know, even today it would be amazing to see if it, you know, we got to see it if it hadn't sadly had its iceberg thing. But one of the pictures here is the Titanic as it stacks up at the time to, you know, various buildings and monuments that we would know. So you have the Washington Monument there, Empire State Building, and you can see the Titanic is larger than all of them. And people, you know, it was promoted big time, and it was really based on the class system. So not only was it leaving on a certain day, as you can see here, and when it would be rolling into America, but, you know, you could be really, you know, lower socioeconomically and get on the ship, and you could be the top tier, you know, John J. Astor type of rich, you know, and wealthy to get on there.
And that was the thing. There were so many rich people on this ship.
Yes.
The Guggenheims, the Astors, like you said.
Vanderbilt, some connections, I believe,
the
were on
Vanderbilt. Hershey got off. He didn't get on the ship. He was supposed to. But
and the movie does a wonderful job, and what we're going to try to do today is supplement, really, some of the, beyond the Indiana connection, is the visuals in the movie. I mean, you could see that they were loading cars and, you know, trunks and all these things. That could hold all of those items.
yeah. That's interesting. Why don't you give the dimensions of the ship? And
So,
maybe we could hold this up first before we give the dimensions so that they can kind of see. I don't know if you can see, but hopefully you can see.
So 882.5 feet in length. So we're talking 3 football fields back to back to back, and then about 92.5 feet across. So this was a massive, massive ship, and one of the biggest of its time. And it had a sister ship that they built as well.
Yeah, it had the, I think that's on the back side, the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic were all 3 ships by the White Star Line.
And maybe on some of the Zoom we can see this, but yeah, the White Star Line company was who produced this epic thing, and beyond just the physical marvel of it, it was a true marketing, you know, and it was the place where you could really travel in style.
Right.
And some of the stuff that we were looking at was, you know, I didn't realize in our research how much it monetized. You know, my assumption was you paid for your ticket and it included almost like a resort. And we were blown away with, you know, this book here. We were looking at some things and some other resources that you pretty much had to pay to do anything cool. But it did reinforce the class system, because if you had the money, you could send a telegram, and you could play on the pool if it was off the hours that it was free, and you could rent different seats on the deck and use the gym and all those things. And the telegraph part will come into play, but that was interesting that there was such a system to do that, and actually they partnered with other ships. So you could pay, and we didn't have a time to dial into the exact amount of the money exchange, but essentially you could pay, and then they would radio a ship, and then that ship would send it to the United States. So you could actually get telegraphs from the, again, this is 1912, and that's pretty big deal, you know.
And was that the Marconi?
That
we
was
talked
the Marconi
about?
system to get that
brand
across. It
new.
was, and that is pretty powerful. And you still had to have, and that was another thing about class, that you had to have the money to pay, because you're paying per word to do the telegrams.
And what's interesting is everything was by class, and this is the White Star Line. This is what you got when you got a little goodie bag when you got on the ship, and obviously class mattered.
Yep.
So everybody wanted to know who's on the ship, and it wasn't who is George, whoever on third class steerage, who's first class passengers. And so what they did, you got this list of first class passengers, and everyone who was on board was put in their own little book. And so this one would have been what you would have, kept track of, who's on first, who's on the first deck, who's on second deck.
Yeah.
But that's what that was, and that's kind of cool because you obviously want to know, are the Guggenheims going to be dining?
Oh yeah, you're going to be rubbing elbows with these
Sure.
people, and it's funny because when we, as in modern day, think about class systems, we think first class, second, like third class might not be, it's kind of lower. As we were studying and thinking about even just the meals, it was talking in there about pea soup and special potatoes, and even for second and third class, and talk to us, because we showed the size of the ship, some of the sheer tonnage of food that went along on this trip was pretty amazing.
Fresh meat. Now this is how much of the provisions that were on this ship. Fresh meat, 75,000 pounds. Fresh fish, 11,000 pounds. Bacon and ham, 7,500 pounds. Fresh eggs, 40,000 eggs. Wow. Let me go through here and see what else is. Oh, coffee, because I would have had to have coffee. 2,200 pounds of coffee, 800 pounds of tea, 10,000 pounds of sugar. And then it gets into the fruit. You had grapes, you had oranges, you had lemons, all kinds of fresh vegetables, and ice cream. 1,750 quarts of ice cream.
We love the third class when we looked at the menu as well, that it was Quaker oatmeal.
Yeah, that was kind of odd that they
marketed it.
They came right out and said, I think that may have been in your book.
It was
yeah.
It was like a sponsorship, if you will.
Yeah, this is, well, and two, we kind of want to look at some of the people who, this was Captain Edward Smith.
Yes.
He was the captain of the Titanic. And this is Captain Smith's crew.
The main crew.
And what was sad about Captain Smith, this was to be his last voyage. He was going to retire after this. So that was kind of sad. Which,
And we talk a little bit about, and it's important to remember we're talking about the modern marvel element, but then that marketing element, like this was a big deal. It was supposed to be a production when this ship got into harbor in the United States.
Yeah.
And they were pushing them. They were pushing them to achieve and, make a statement.
Well, and they stopped at Cherbourg in France. They picked up more first-class passengers there. And then finally, when they got to Southampton, some people got off because they didn't want to go. And that's going to bring us into your person. There were 14 known Hoosiers on the Titanic.
Yeah.
And some of them even have a Bedford connection.
Yes,
So
yes.
what did you find on that?
I'm so pumped to talk about this guy. There was a guy, now we're, in Lawrence County in Bedford, but if you go up north just a little bit to Bloomington to the Rose Hill Cemetery, you will find a headstone, and a very nice headstone at that, for a guy named John Bertram Crafton, and he had this stone built about 10 years before he died, and he was lost on the Titanic. He was a self-made, very wealthy guy that worked in limestone. And again, a couple shows ago we talked about, Vic Aldridge, the Hoosier schoolmaster. This guy's got some cool nicknames too, the Stone King.
Do you have his picture?
I
Should
do.
Is there a newspaper
Yes.
article with a picture of him so
That's
we
a
can?
good call to get a frame of reference on.
Yeah, just to see what this guy looked like.
Yeah.
Now, what was his reason for being?
It's a very good question. He was, and we'll have to put this picture in at the
Yeah.
end here. I'm so sorry to not bring that.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
But he was suffering badly from arthritis, and he was looking for treatments to help him. And in that time window, the late 1800s into the early 1900s, they'd have these places that were called sanitariums or spas, and you would go there and get, saltwater treatments or other things to fix your ailments. So he was in Europe doing this, and again, quite wealthy guy, and his family was expecting him to come back, but they didn't expect him to be on the Titanic. But in early April, on the 10th around there, he wanted to come home, so he paid about $2,300 in today's money to get on to the Titanic. He actually had a ticket for another ship heading this way, but he couldn't pass it over, and he was coming over as a first-class passenger. And they didn't know, and in what I was looking at research, I was hoping to find some sort of telegraph type of thing that he said, hey, I'm, heading over. Of course, now I'd probably send a selfie or a text and say, I'm getting on the ship, excited. But they didn't really know. So he was on the ship, and he went down with it, sadly, when it went down.
Because his family didn't know, how long did it say? How long they gave
For
hope?
weeks. His wife was really, hoping, and again, that also speaks to the class system, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the sinking here in a minute.
Yeah.
But he was a first-class passenger, and she assumed that. She didn't know for sure because, again, she didn't know he was on the ship.
Right.
But she clung to hope that, okay, as a first-class passenger, he may have gotten on a lifeboat, and he just, was taking time to get word, and he didn't. So he, eventually passed, and on the back, so we had on the first side of his stone, and then on the back one here is, his date. So his wife and son that lived past birth were alive until the late 1930s. Okay. So, they definitely were hit hard with that loss. But again, he made a fortune on Indiana limestone, and he must have been really, really hurting, because to take a trip like that all the way across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, that's amazing that someone from around here would have that kind of money.
Yes.
Because we don't think about people from Indiana. I was looking to see if I had his, but I don't. I don't have anything on him. I gave that, I think, past it. But when we think about that night, and everybody who would have been having their dinner and had gone below deck, some of them, to go to their rooms, it was just a normal evening for them. But it wasn't without warning, because the captain had been given warning. The Marconi people had gotten warnings, and they all brushed them off.
Yes, and it's sad. You were telling me about the Marconi team was not employed by White Star, so I can almost see them being like, get out of here with that. Like, but if they might have been White Star, they might have been listened to a little more, maybe not. Because again, there was that push to achieve. We have to be faster. We've got to be the main, travel company that people want to go with.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've already said this, but this was going to be the captain's last voyage. So, he was even wanting to make it look like, we can do this. So there had been icebergs, and if you've seen the movies, iceberg, straight ahead, and this is the actual iceberg. In searching around for pictures, and the reason why we know this is because this was taken from what's the front part of the ship?
Oh, the
Stern. I'm not a seafaring person. Okay, well, now I'm showing I have no clue.
No, it's okay. People might be even in the comments saying, it's not the stern, it's something else.
Remember where Rose was? You know,
Yes, exactly.
We didn't do it.
We didn't do it.
We laughed about that. Okay, I know it's a history joke. Nobody else would get it. But anyway, this is the actual iceberg from the front of the ship. Somebody had their camera.
And that's on the Carpathia?
This is on the Carpathia that came and picked him up, and we'll talk about it. I did kind of want to, since we're going to be talking about
I'm glad
sinking.
you did. And look at the foreground of that photo, too. That's
These
a
are
bunch of
ice
other little
floes.
ones. Yeah, so it's not that was like a minefield almost.
Right, and that's what they had said. This is a minefield that you're getting ready to go through, and everybody's like, yeah, whatever.
Well, and we forget this in the story because it's so long ago, but it was April. So it's still cold.
Yeah.
You know, it's springtime in the States and in England, but we're still talking about the cold ocean that it hasn't had that flow of the water that it does its thing when it's midsummer.
And where it is, because we're talking northern Atlantic.
Yes, they went over and then kind of coming down into New York. Yeah.
Yeah, because of the icebergs too, during that time of year, they would have taken that. So, do you want to hold up the telegram?
Yes.
Telegraph.
Yes.
So, several times during the night, there were telegraphs that came into the Marconi system that said, steer away, don't go. And then the inevitable happened.
Yep.
And the iceberg was struck. And this is the telegraph that was sent to get help. Can you see what it said?
Yes, and it's so formal but urgent. And again, each word had to be set up the right way. It says, "We have struck iceberg, sinking fast. Come to our assistance." Period. And then it gives the longitude and latitude of where they're at, and that is at 11:45 and they even knew that it was coming in at a late hour, so they did April 14th, 15th. So they knew they were getting ready to cross over into the next day.
Because they would be going through the next time zone too.
And exactly. So and they put they have a remarks section, and they're doing distress calls.
Yeah.
So not only
they had the
flares.
Flares.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, here is the second class dining menu for dinner on the night of the sinking on April 14th. This was found, it's got a little water damage where they've made the facsimile, but someone who knew they weren't going to make it had penned a letter to their cousin, and it talks about that person's, this is what we've been doing. I don't know if I'll see you again, but this is one of those last ditch efforts to get a hold of someone. When we talk about the people on the ship, we have to think too, there were all these people who were crew. And this little gem is when the crew signed in, they filled out identity cards in the hope that they wouldn't have to use them, but these became the tags that a lot of them had on their body bags. And this happened to belong to Percy Ball, and I can't see really. It's hard to read.
Okay.
But his picture is on the back.
Yes, he was born in England in 1893, so not very old. Early 20s.
And a lot of these people, the night of the sinking, stayed at their posts. There was a pretty high number of crew who passed, but a lot of them stayed on till the very, very end. And so the iceberg goes, and then at 12:45.
Yeah, it was just right around an hour, a little over an hour.
Now, talk to us about the class. How did that work as the ship is sinking?
Well, it's interesting, and it is a good. Well, and I want to point out too, without even knowing it, we're pretty nerdy with this. We really, I'm not afraid to admit it. We've each been to our. We do. We own it. But we each have been to real Titanic exhibits to see the things that they've captured, which again is just fascinating. But you'd think in a moment, we already talked about the class on the front end with the dining and with the privileges, et cetera. But sadly, it extended into the sinking. So people that were first class, they wanted more space on the thing. You know, you'd think you'd be cramming in as many people as you could, and we already know, you know, from just the knowledge of the sinking in general, that there were not enough life, you know, boats and units on the ship to accommodate everybody. So even then, people were wanting to make sure that there was space, and oh, I don't want a lower class person on mine. Go find another one. Meanwhile, all of these terrible things are happening. People are falling off and screaming, and you know.
And the doors are locked. And
Yes.
that part of the movie was true, where they had locked the gates to get down to the lower class. Some people did go down and unlock some doors, but the water was already starting to come in. So, I mean, like when we went to the exhibit, did you get the exhibit where the water comes in?
I did not, because mine was a traveling one, so it didn't have that set up on it, which would have been really interesting to see.
You can see there's a door, and you can see the water rushing in, and you get that feeling of kind of panic. And then you go up, and you can actually go on the, whatever that is, the bow. I can't think. That part of the ship.
If we just do this, we can put in a voice over it, so she'll do it the right way.
You can touch the iceberg. You can walk out on the deck and actually touch the iceberg. And you can feel how, you know, when the ship started to go, you try to walk up. They have the part where you try to climb up, and you can't.
No, because it's such a pitch. And the thing is that even you'd think when you're in a shared experience like a big ship like this, that it would create some sort of camaraderie, but they really were segmented. So even the word of the ship, you know, people obviously felt it and were experiencing it that way, but it wasn't like White Star representatives were running down there to say, hey, everybody, this just happened. We need to do whatever. You know, it was, you know, you're kind of fend for yourself to a degree.
And they were in shock. Bruce Ismay, who, you know, got kind of the blame for wanting to push. You know, he goes back and tries to get in and gets in a lifeboat, you know, and a lot of people give him a hard way to go because it was only women and children, first class first, and then it went down through the class.
And the sad part is, and you know, eyewitnesses that lived, experienced, and you have this great photo of just, you know, the people, you can tell are just in shock, but not all the boats were this full.
No.
So we talk about just the sheer math of it. So we have not enough boats to accommodate there is on that one, accommodate every person that's on the ship. But even with that, there were lifeboats that weren't full. So we're already at a disadvantage. And it's just, and it's so sad to see that the class system continued on while you could literally look out. Because, you know, the electricity was still running for part of the time.
Right.
So you could see this horror, you know, coming out in front of you, and you're like, no, don't get on my ship, here's third class.
And there were so many stories about women whose children, you know, they tried to get everybody together, and some people got disconnected from their families, and trying to dress their children to look like girls, putting capes around them and hats so that they could get on the boats. I mean, I cannot imagine how that would feel, knowing that, you know, your children were separated from you in a disaster like that. But there was a guy, and I was reading this, where he had divorced his wife and took his children without her knowing. And he got an assumed name and got on the Titanic with these two little boys.
Whoa.
I think they were 1 and 2. And when it came time for them to load on the boats, the little boys got to go, but he couldn't because he was second class. So he dropped the boys basically down into a boat and got them, and then somebody took care of them until they got to New York. Wow. And somebody, for 2 weeks, they waited for the mother, who didn't even know they were on the Titanic. They put their pictures on. That's how she knew, in the newspapers. And she recognized them as her little boys and came to New York.
Yeah. And so many people passed.
Oh. Now this gal, do we know who she is? You know who her?
I'm going to guess that's Molly Brown.
That's the unsinkable Molly Brown.
That's right.
She was one of the ladies that took charge on one of these lifeboats that was not full. And so she basically threatened to kill whoever gave her any grief, and went back and got a few people. But it was people like her that said, no, we're going to go back and try to rescue people. I just can't imagine.
I can't either, and again, we've said it, and I don't mean to be, keep going with the point, but the idea of just the full integration of the class system. I mean, these White Star people that were doing the rowboats, the lifeboats, like, they were following blindly these orders of class.
Yeah.
It's like they didn't even have the own self-confidence or whatever to be like, this is really dumb. I should get as many people on as I can so we can get away from this thing.
And one of the things, too, they did not even have a drill. They were supposed to have a lifeboat drill. They chose not to do that. Had they done it, there were blankets, there was food in the lifeboats themselves. No one knew to look.
Yeah.
And so people had frostbite and got, all kinds of things because they had not prepared. So that was, that's going to change too. So this is
the big one.
Yeah, this is the next morning. J.J. Astor lost on the Titanic. Astor was there with his new wife, who was, 18? Madeline, who was pregnant.
Yes.
So that was a big story, John Jacob Astor. He did go down with the ship. There is a story that tells about him, though, how he helped get some people on the ship or on the boats, and then he went back into the smoking room where he waited. But we have to remember, too, that during this time there is no media other than, and these pictures would have been taken prior to the ship leaving. So this is, the headline alone makes you think, oh, good grief, what's happened. And then the next morning are the telltales, the newsboys that, have the news. And still people didn't realize that their loved ones had perished until the Carpathia comes in. And one of the things, too, that to me shows, again, kind of the snobbiness, I guess, for lack of better terms, people not wanting to give up their seats on the lifeboats and stuff. And while they're fighting and trying to get on these boats, the orchestra, who are all there, on deck playing as the boat goes down.
When I first, I saw that in the movie, of course, and I read more about it because, again, we're talking about nerding out on this. I honestly thought that was made up. Like, are they really doing that? And they did.
This is their sheet from the church service that day.
Yeah.
Nearer my God to thee, and then on the back is in French because there were French passengers. But that was all true.
Yeah.
That was true. The people on the ships, and we think about the people who worked, White Star treated them pretty less than stellar.
Yeah.
They were charged, their families,
to go on,
for their uniforms because they drowned. And 2 or 3 people were told their sons or their daughters had drowned in the Titanic. That's how they learned, because they got a bill from White Star Line.
Oh, that's so gross and sad.
And then this is just kind of talking about, it's another one of those bills that came in, and they want the government to do their part and, help the people on the ship that drowned, their families and whatnot.
Well, and it speaks to, you said, the lack of preparedness even on the ship for drills. I mean, this was billed as an unsinkable ship.
Oh, right.
And that was no joke. So that's partially, I think, why there's such a state of shock. And, White Star that was a pretty big PR hit to their big, business.
And in the newspapers, of course, the next Sunday, every church started having memorial services for the victims. And a lot of the victims were not picked up immediately, because once the Carpathia came, and then another ship went out to try to pick up some more.
Yeah.
Did you find anything on that?
I did not, because the Carpathia is
kind
of, yes. And, they weren't really equipped to expect what they expected either.
No, and that little pink thing that I gave you, that was one of the ways. Or if people back then, they usually had their initials in their shirts, and maybe that was because of dry cleaning back then. You took your shirts to get them fixed, or on the ship they probably did your laundry for you.
They had a laundry service that you could pay for, and a lot of the staff, in reading and studying some of this, were wearing almost like an armband, which would state their number and or their classification, because it was, you know, who to reference if you needed to voice a complaint or ask questions.
So you could refer back to them. Some of the things that happened were when you get from one port to the other, there's things that have to be registered, filled out, and this is one of those shipping forms. And this is the transaction between Liverpool and what was supposed to be New York, and that's the back of it. But if you look, it's correspondence received, stamped June 12th, and then here in red they've written the ship sank. So there's no need to continue with the...
The vessel went down.
Yeah, sank, and that was the end of it. And then there would be memorials, and this one is the Titanic actually had a newspaper that they put out. And so this shows, you know, the pictures that were part of the ship, and it's a memorial, and it talks about each of the people who passed, you know, the grave, the people who died on the Titanic.
What a heavy phrase, to the ocean grave of the Titanic.
And the sad part, on top of the sad part, here's some more to that. The sad part on top of the sad part was those people that they could not find, that were not accounted for, they washed in later. And some of these bodies came to, or were taken off of the sea near Nova Scotia. And there are 3 cemeteries in Nova Scotia that have those, and I was fortunate. We went to all 3 when we went to Nova Scotia I think I was in 8th grade. And at that time, I don't know if we talked about that or not, but I knew there was a ship called the Titanic, but you know, in 8th grade, we really hadn't studied it yet. That was later in high school. So it didn't resonate with me what this was until we walked up and saw at Halifax the cemetery with all of these graves and all of these people, and it, you know, a lot of them didn't have names. One of the saddest things was a pair of shoes that was found when the wreckage went down. You know, and they brought certain things up from the ship, and I know I've got those little pair of shoes somewhere. It's going to drive me nuts, but anyway. This one child, his name was Sidney, but of course they didn't know who he was. And when the ship went down, his mother and he were separated. With the other children, he was 2. And when the ship went down, they couldn't account for him. So they thought that this little Sidney had been lost at sea. And then they found these shoes. And they said, oh, these shoes, you know, or what I can't find it, what he had on. And so the family had DNA tests on the remains of the unknown little boy that was in the cemetery. And when they had the DNA done, and this is, I know you can't see it, but this is the picture of his grave.
Sydney's, yes.
They gave him a name because for 60, 70 years, he was known as the unknown child. And that was the White Star and the people of Halifax went in together and paid for this little boy to be buried. And they bought his headstone and whatnot. And then the family came and gave DNA samples, people who were descendants, and they found out that he really was the little Sidney, and his shoes are on display at one of the museums.
And speaking of the things that we've seen in museums and those shoes and the other DNA, Titanic started out as a modern marvel, like we talked about, and just the amazing elements of it. And then you have the aspect of the things that scientists and oceanographers and all engineers, to build the equipment to go down and even get stuff, which is quite fascinating in and of itself in the 80s when you see these, you know, explorers essentially go down and like rescue the things that we got to see in our museum trips.
That is what's neat. When we think about some of these things on the floor of the ocean, one of the things you see in the big exhibit are shoes and things. They have recreated the ocean floor, and you stand above it, and it's like you're looking down, and you're seeing all the items, and you see all these shoes. And of course, when I was younger, I thought, oh, okay, there's all those shoes. Wow, somebody's luggage probably dumped out. No, that was where the bodies.
Yeah, and that was all that was left.
That was all that was left. Are
Because
their
they were
shoes.
probably leather shoes that
Yeah.
And there's so much stuff on that ship that, one of the things that really struck me at the exhibit, and I saw it in Baltimore, was it was a full dishes set. Well, it was in a beautiful cabinet, if you will, that they used, and it was the White Star Line labeled plates and tea saucers and all that. And it had this beautiful cabinet that all the things fit in, and they just carried it up.
And they hadn't been broken. They were all just
they were there.
inside.
And you almost don't believe it, but then of course they were preserved, really, because they just sat at the ocean floor.
Yeah, and just the type. There was a doll that I remember seeing.
Hairbrushes and there was the doll things and like glasses. So I saw a lot of pairs of glasses.
We talked about the orchestra, the violin.
Yeah.
That was what was neat because it's on display.
Yeah.
And it travels. I think it was in Branson, and then it was at Pigeon Forge when we were there, so we got to see it. So that's something, if you've never had the pleasure of going to one of those. I mean, your kids would love it because they actually get, like I said, go up and touch the actual feeling of what an iceberg would feel like and what the ship, when it started to go down, and it was
And their projections, one I saw was a projection of what the iceberg, how deep it actually was, and it was pretty scary.
Yeah, I had a picture of that too, but I digress. But that was the thing. This iceberg, people were amazed that there was so much coverage on the iceberg, but yet they didn't believe that they thought they were invincible out there on the ocean.
Yeah, and they were trucking.
Oh, definitely trucking. And that's another thing too, because when I was reading the account about the trial, and they brought all of these people in, Lightoller and I think it was McBride and different ones, and they grilled them because they survived. And they brought in another captain of another ship who was close by, and I can't think of the name of the ship. But he was like, well, we couldn't have got there. And then they started doing the calculations. And this was after the trial, and found that ship was so close that when they got the first flare, they would have been able to save a lot of the people from, freezing to death in the waters, that the Carpathia took longer, to get there. And they were actually closer than the Carpathia when they got the first warning. So
just adds to the legend of the tragedy of it.
Yeah, it just makes you think, what a waste. I mean, what a total waste for people to have to perish like that. So that's the Titanic part.
Powerful stuff.
Powerful stuff. So then after the Titanic, World War I is the next disaster. And we won't get into that today, but there are casualties of war, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about, and that is the Lusitania. The Lusitania was very similar to the Titanic.
Yeah.
After the Titanic sank, there were other measures that were brought in. Remember we talked about the lifeboats?
Oh, yeah. There was definitely, not to say they overdid it, but they were really focused on making sure that if anything ever happened again like that, on that route, that they would be well served with life jackets and the food and the boats and all the things.
They would have to have that. And this is a picture of the Lusitania as it's leaving for its voyage. One of the things we have to remember about the Lusitania is it was a British ship, and again, I think it was the Cunard line, they had been warned. Over and over, do not sail around the English Channel because, obviously, we're at war. And Germany had already said, we're going to bomb anybody that's out in the middle of the water. Again, the arrogance of, well, they won't bother us because we're a passenger ship. The problem with that was...
Were they really?
Were they really? And we know, no, they weren't.
Yeah, exactly.
The problem with this ship was they were carrying munitions, and the munitions were hidden in their supplies. They had potatoes, big crates, and they had shells. And I mean, it was amazing at the amount of ammunition that was on this ship. Well, obviously that played into it because the Germans had been secretly listening in to a lot of the where they talk over, and knew that they were carrying that. So they really put those people in harm's way. This is the captain, Captain Turner of the Carpathia, another captain that had been in the sea for quite a while. I mean, he had been in service to that. Let's see, I was trying to think how long the ship was. And it was very similar to the Titanic.
I don't think it eclipsed it, but it was pretty long.
Yeah, let's see if I've got the stats on it, because I know we both had stats on our ships.
And again, this is a different one in the element of they really were warned, like, don't go do this because they will shoot you. So this is a different than, and there were some warnings for the Titanic as far as potentials for icebergs. And you can understand to a degree the hubris of the Titanic crew of like, we'll be all right. But these were like submarines coming after them.
Yeah, this was out in the middle of the ocean where the submarines, and the first submarine didn't hit its mark. It was the second one that hit its mark. But this is another view of the Lusitania as it's going out to sea. The Lusitania was built by the Cunard Line, just like the Titanic. It was in Liverpool for a short time. Its maiden voyage was in September of 1907. So it had sailed from 1907 to 1905. So it had 8 years.
Yeah.
Back and forth.
Way more than Titanic, obviously.
And there is an Indiana connection or two. Now, I'm just going to give the one that's closest, but there were 13, I believe, Indiana passengers on the Lusitania.
Passengers bound for Indiana, because there was a lady from Lebanon and some others, but they were, for whatever reason, all converging to come to Indiana.
Right, and so if you're interested in the Lusitania because of time, I would Google that and go to the Indiana State Museum, because the museum in Indiana has pictures of everyone. And all of these passengers that we've talked about today, with the exception, I think, of who is the stone man?
Oh, Crafton?
Crafton.
Yes.
They were all third class, with the exception of him.
Yes.
And this fellow that we're going to talk about was a man who was actually on the Lusitania and was considered a millionaire, and he is from Seymour.
Is this our car guy?
Yes. And his name was E. Blish Thompson. And Blish Thompson had was going to sail for New York from Europe. He had visited family. He knew of the danger. He had been warned of the danger of being torpedoed, but he laughed at his fears and determined to sail on his business mission. He was secretary and sales manager of the Blish Milling Company of Seymour and was going to England to look after a contract that he had in Holland. And this is the newspaper account showing he's kind of a nice-looking gentleman there, quite dapper. So that's Mr. Blish Thompson. He invented this car, and I think that's probably on something else.
I remember seeing it.
Yeah. Here it is. And it says on the newspaper, was it a case of kismet with Blish Thompson of Seymour? And this is a picture of a car he designed that looked like a submarine. And that was Adventurous Submarines, European War. It doesn't say when exactly he made this, but it was enough that people remembered.
Kind of a sad use of the phrase kismet, too.
Yeah.
Tragic kismet.
Very tragic.
Yeah.
So he is on board. At first, his wife held out hope that he would be back and then everything would be fine. And this is his wife. When Mr. Thompson passes away, she does not immediately assume that he's on board. So she waits a good long while. And then finally, with the others, the tragedy, it comes to pass that, you know, he was on board. But this lady actually marries a Frenchman and ends up moving to France and living, I think he's a duke or some kind of, yeah. So.
Well, and it's, you know, the Titanic sinking, took so long, and it had this tragic beauty to it. You know, we talked about the music and the things and the boats, and I can't imagine it. I mean, it seems like, well, it's quite, I bet it was extremely sad and loud, and people were screaming, etc. The Lusitania members on that ship did not get that much time.
No, and this is a better picture of Mr. Blish. No, in fact, he was 32. It says that most of the people, when the explosion happened, there were two. One was the actual torpedo. They believe the other was the munitions.
Yeah.
And that was what caused the second big explosion. Mr. Blish is actually buried in Seymour.
Yeah.
So you can see his grave there in Seymour.
So if you want to do a Disasters of the Decade road trip, you could loop to Seymour and Rose Hill Cemetery.
Yeah, you could do both.
See both.
There were 1,264 total passengers aboard the Lusitania, including stowaways and crew. There was a grand total of 1,960. There were actually 3 stowaways aboard. Well, you talk about not a good plan.
No.
767 people of that survived. 1,193 died. So there was a survival rate of 39% if you were on this ship going, you know.
Yeah.
So there was that. Now, the news is kind of like with Titanic. The newspapers start showing immediately pictures of what the Lusitania looked like. And obviously, war hawks are screaming to go to war. Life jackets start coming in. This one, it says, found in the Delaware River. That's a long way for and a lot of bodies, which is sad. When I was doing the research, there's a lot of sites that have mortuary pictures because they were trying to figure out who these people were.
Yeah, and you'd have to, you know, because they were not looking great, but you at least gave you something to work off of.
Yeah, you had to know who these people were. And the sad thing, about 94 children died aboard the Lusitania, which I think was a little more than what was on the Titanic that passed, because a lot of those kids.
They got to get on the ships.
Yeah, and so 94 children died, and then they had to bury all these people. And this kind of sums up, a lot of them got put in unmarked large mass graves, but every one of these burials was given, and a lot of them were Catholic, so they were given you know, a Catholic burial, because a lot of them were Irish that were on these ships. So that's one picture.
Well, in the work of the dead, if you will, in both of these disasters too, there's an element of, and sadly an element of, just the logistics of paperwork after. You know, you had to identify them because there might have been insurance connotations or estate finalizations.
Right. And there were a lot of villages where the whole village had someone they knew on the ship. So this is a picture of a burial that was taking place in a town, and I don't recall the name of the town, but it shows the funeral hearse and all of the people coming out, because there were so many people they knew in that burial. And that's just another happy. Look what I found. Little Sydney's shoes. 2-year-old Sydney, identified through DNA. These were the shoes that he had on.
Yeah, on that night, 14th,
on
15th.
that night, So, this is the Lusitania now at the bottom. Looks a lot like the Titanic.
Yes.
Where it is, and it is off the coast of, not far off the United States coast. And
yeah, because some of that stuff came in.
Yeah, but it looks a lot like the Titanic, and they've been diving down to the wreck sites and whatnot. But a lot of things we aren't going to get to today, obviously, because of time. But that just gives you fuel to go out and look some of these things up. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one more person.
Yes.
And this is Violet Jessup. Violet Jessup was a nurse. She started out as, I think she was around 19, on the Titanic. And of course, the Titanic sinks.
Oh, yes.
And bless her heart, she got on board the ship. She went back to work for White Star Line. They put her back on.
So she survives part one.
And then she goes from the Titanic to the Britannic, and it is also hit. Now, I believe the Britannic was a hospital ship during World War I, and she was hit again. Down goes the ship. She's able to get off, survived, and darned her luck.
Yes. She's 2 down now.
The third ship, the Olympic, she gets on, and it also sinks. And this is during the war, and she is taken off the ship and vows to not sail again.
It's a double thing. You see, it's powerful because she was serving as a nurse, so to keep helping. The other side is, why do they keep letting her get on the ship?
Yeah, it's like, we have unsinkable Molly Brown, who you want her there.
Yeah, exactly. So sorry,
Yeah,
Violet.
She's kind of a bad omen.
Yeah, we bring you along. The neat thing with this too, again, these always seem like such national or worldwide, stories, but it's pretty neat to have these Hoosier connections.
Yeah, and we didn't go over near half of the ones who were from Indianapolis and surrounding areas, but these are the ones we found from the surrounding counties, Monroe, Jackson, and then they had a Bedford connection too. So when we talk about these deadly disasters of the decades, we have to also understand there was a war going on that we hadn't at this point got into yet, but this will be kind of the push that the people start saying, 1912, Woodrow Wilson gets elected president, so that was the year of the Titanic, and then he has to deal with,
just a few years later, the war starts.
With the war. So I want to thank you so
thank you.
much. We
such
had
a
so much
joy.
fun geeking out
We
together
should have done
on
our
this.
thing, though.
I know.
We had a thing.
Yeah,
we were
going
to do it.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
there's always next time. There's always the next disaster.
Or the outtakes.
Yeah, there you go. At the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so Lucas Calhoun has been my guest today, and we have had a ball putting this show together, even though it's a very sad topic and, not one that we make light of. But we had a good time finding all this information out and sharing it with you. So our next show, we'll move on to the next disaster or whatever else.
Progressing through the 20th century.
Going through the 20th century. So you'll have to stay tuned to see what we find out for the next
Awesome.
show. All right, so I'm your host, Lori Roberts. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining this program with us, and we'll see you next time.